In today's documentary, we will discuss game theory. Game theory is the mathematical science of strategic decision-making. It is the science of figuring out what the best move is when your best move depends entirely on someone else's best move, and their best move depends entirely on yours. It sounds circular. It is. That is exactly the problem it was built to solve, and it has solved things you would not believe. It has explained why nuclear superpowers did not destroy each other during 40 years of the Cold War, even though both of them had every weapon they needed to do exactly that. It has explained why biological organisms that have no brain, no consciousness, and no ability to think somehow evolve to cooperate with each other in patterns that look from the outside like they were planned. It has explained why auctions work, why markets fail, why traffic jams happen even when every individual driver is making a perfectly rational choice, and why you sometimes cannot trust the person sitting across the table from you, even when trusting them would make both of you better off. It has also been used in the last decade alone to redesign kidney transplant matching systems that save thousands of lives every year, to build artificial intelligence systems that beat the best human players in the most complex games ever invented, and to understand the internal logic of biological evolution at the molecular level. Let's begin. 1944. The world is at war. The most destructive conflict in human history is consuming entire continents. Tens of millions of people are dying. The greatest scientific minds alive are building weapons capable of annihilating cities in a single flash of light. And in Princeton, New Jersey, a Hungarian-American mathematician named John von Neumann and an Austrian economist named Oskar Morgenstern are sitting together and writing a book. The book is called Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. It is 640 pages long. It is almost completely unreadable to anyone who has not spent years training in advanced mathematics. And it will, in the decades that follow, become one of the most influential scientific documents ever written. But to understand why, you need to understand what economics looked like before it existed. For most of its history, economics had been built on a very simple and very comfortable assumption. The assumption was this: if you want to understand how an individual person or a firm makes decisions, you study that individual in isolation. You ask, what is the best choice for them, given the prices, the resources, and the constraints they face? And the best choice is simply the one that maximizes their benefit. This framework had a name. It was called optimization, and it was extremely powerful. It could predict how much of a good a rational consumer would buy at a given price. It could predict how much a profit-maximizing firm would produce. It could derive the conditions under which markets would reach equilibrium. But it had one enormous gaping hole. It assumed that the choices of one agent did not depend on the choices of other agents. It treated each decision-maker as if they were alone in the universe, calculating their best response to fixed external conditions. In reality, of course, no decision-maker is ever alone. When a company decides how to price its product, it is not just responding to consumer demand. It is responding to what its competitors are charging and its competitors are doing exactly the same thing in reverse. When a country decides whether to build more weapons, it is not just calculating its own security needs. It is watching what the country next door is doing, and the country next door is watching it back. When a poker player decides whether to raise or fold, they're not calculating a fixed probability distribution over outcomes. They are trying to read and outthink another human being who is simultaneously trying to read and outthink them. Classical economics had no language for any of this. It had no mathematical tools for situations where the best decision of each person depended on the decisions of everyone else simultaneously. It had no framework for what happens when strategic interdependence is the fundamental feature of the problem rather than a complication to be ignored. Von Neumann and Morgenstern saw this hole, and they decided to fill it. John von Neumann is, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. He was born in Budapest in 1903 into a wealthy Jewish banking family. By the age of 6, he could memorize and recite phone books. By the age of 8, he had mastered calculus. By the time he was a teenager, he was corresponding with some of the leading mathematicians in Europe on equal terms. He eventually earned 2 simultaneous degrees from 2 different universities, one in chemical engineering from Zurich, one in mathematics from Budapest, and completed his doctorate in mathematics at the age of 22. His doctoral thesis single-handedly axiomatized set theory in a way that is still used today. He went on to make foundational contributions to quantum mechanics, to the theory of self-replicating machines, to the architecture of digital computers, to nuclear weapons design, and to the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics again, but differently and more rigorously the second time. He was known for being able to perform complex calculations in his head faster than most people could do them on paper. He was known for being able to absorb and synthesize vast amounts of new information almost instantaneously. He was known for working at a pace that exhausted everyone around him, and he was deeply, obsessively interested in games. Specifically, he was interested in what he called the problem of strategy in zero-sum games, meaning games where one player's gain is exactly equal to another player's loss. He had been thinking about this problem since the early 1920s, when he proved his first major result in what would become game theory. And the result he proved was called the minimax theorem. Imagine you are playing a game against an opponent. The game is zero-sum. Whatever you win, they lose. Whatever they win, you lose. Both of you are rational. Both of you are trying to maximize your own outcome. Your opponent knows this. You know this. Your opponent knows that you know this. You know that your opponent knows that you know this. And so on forever. Now, in most real games, you can choose different strategies in different proportions. In poker, you do not always bet when you have a good hand, because if you did, your opponents would learn to read you. Sometimes you bet with a bad hand. Sometimes you fold with a good hand. The question is, what is the optimal mixture? This is what von Neumann's minimax theorem answered. The theorem says this: In any finite two-player zero-sum game, there always exists an optimal mixed strategy for each player, where a mixed strategy means a probability distribution over your available pure strategies. And when both players play their optimal mixed strategies, the expected outcome of the game is a single fixed value, called the value of the game. Moreover, this value has a remarkable property. It is simultaneously the maximum of the minimum guaranteed outcome for one player and the minimum of the maximum guaranteed outcome for the other. The minimum of the maximum and the maximum of the minimum are equal. That is the minimax part of the theorem. What this means in plain language is this: no matter how clever your opponent is, you can guarantee yourself at least a certain outcome by playing your optimal strategy. And your opponent can guarantee themselves at least a certain outcome by playing their optimal strategy. These guarantees are consistent with each other. There is no contradiction. There is a single equilibrium point that both strategies converge on simultaneously. For zero-sum games, von Neumann had found the mathematical foundation. The question was whether this foundation could be extended to something much more general. Could it handle games where there were more than two players? Could it handle games where the payoffs were not zero-sum? Could it handle the full complexity of real economic and strategic interaction? That is what theory of games and economic behavior attempted to do. The book Von Neumann and Morgenstern, published in 1944, was in many respects a beginning rather than an ending. It established a formal mathematical language for describing strategic situations. It introduced the concept of a game as a mathematical object defined by players, strategies, and payoffs. It developed the theory of zero-sum two-player games in detail. And it began the harder project of thinking about what happens in more complicated situations. But it left the hardest problem almost completely unsolved. That hardest problem was this: what happens in a non-zero-sum game with more than two players? What is the concept of optimal play when your interests are not perfectly opposed to your opponents? When you might both gain from cooperation? When there might be many different coalitions of players, each with different combined payoffs? Von Neumann and Morgenstern tried to handle this with a concept called cooperative game theory, which focused on which coalitions of players would form and how they would divide their collective payoff. But this approach had serious limitations. It required players to be able to communicate, make binding agreements, and form enforceable coalitions. And many real strategic situations do not work like that. The breakthrough that would solve the non-cooperative version of the problem, the version where players cannot make binding agreements and must act independently, would come not from von Neumann, but from a 21-year-old graduate student who arrived at Princeton in 1948 with a one-page letter of recommendation that said simply, "This man is a mathematical genius." His name was John Nash. John Forbes Nash Jr. was born in Bluefield, West Virginia in 1928. He was, by most accounts, a difficult person. Arrogant, competitive, difficult to work with, not particularly interested in other people's feelings. But he was capable of a kind of focused mathematical insight that is genuinely rare in any generation. When he arrived at Princeton for his graduate studies, he was entering one of the most concentrated intellectual environments that had ever existed. Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study was home to Albert Einstein, Kurt Gödel, Hermann Weyl, and von Neumann himself. The mathematics department was among the best in the world, and the atmosphere crackled with competition. Nash was 21 years old. Within 2 years, he would publish a paper of fewer than 3 pages that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in economics and permanently change the way human beings think about strategic interaction. The paper was about a concept he called an equilibrium point. We now call it the Nash equilibrium. The Nash equilibrium is one of those ideas that sounds simple when you first hear it and reveals its depth only as you keep thinking about it. Here is the definition. A Nash equilibrium is a combination of strategies, one for each player in the game, such that no single player can improve their outcome by changing their own strategy, while all other players keep their strategies fixed. In other words, at a Nash equilibrium, every player is already playing their best response to what everyone else is doing. No one has any incentive to deviate. The strategies are mutually consistent, the system is stable, and Nash proves something extraordinary. Every finite game, meaning every game with a finite number of players and a finite number of strategies, has at least one Nash equilibrium if you allow players to use mixed strategies. This was not obvious. It was not easy to prove, and it was not what anyone expected. Von Neumann's minimax theorem had proved the existence of equilibria for 2-player zero-sum games specifically. Nash's theorem extended this to any finite game whatsoever. Any number of players, any combination of payoffs, zero-sum or not, cooperative structure or not. Always at least one equilibrium exists. The proof used a mathematical tool called Kakutani's fixed-point theorem, which is a generalization of a result called Brouwer's fixed-point theorem. The intuition is this. If you have a function that maps a compact convex set into itself in a continuous way, there must be at least one point in that set that the function maps to itself. That is called a fixed point. Nash showed that the mapping from strategy profiles to best response strategy profiles has the right properties to guarantee a fixed point. And that fixed point is the Nash equilibrium. But here is the thing about Nash equilibria that makes them both powerful and troubling. They are not necessarily good. There is one game that appears more often in books about game theory, economics, political science, biology and philosophy than any other game. It is called The Prisoner's Dilemma, and it is the single most powerful illustration of why Nash equilibria can be rational and catastrophic at the same time. Here is the setup. 2 suspects are arrested for a crime. They are taken to separate interrogation rooms. They cannot communicate with each other. Each is offered the same deal. If you confess and your partner stays silent, you go free and your partner gets 10 years in prison. If you stay silent and your partner confesses, you get 10 years and your partner goes free. If you both confess, you each get 6 years. If you both stay silent, you each get only 1 year, because the police only have enough evidence to convict you of a minor charge. Now, What do you do? If your partner stays silent, you are better off confessing. You go free instead of serving 1 year. If your partner confesses, you are still better off confessing. You get 6 years instead of 10. No matter what your partner does, confessing is your dominant strategy. It is always better for you than staying silent, regardless of what the other person chooses. Your partner faces exactly the same calculation. So they confess too. The result? Both of you confess. Both of you serve 6 years, but if you had both stayed silent, you would each have served only 1 year. The outcome where both of you cooperate is better for both of you than the outcome where both of you defect. But that cooperative outcome is not a Nash equilibrium, because at that outcome each player has an incentive to deviate. If your partner is staying silent, you can improve your outcome by confessing. So the Nash equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma is mutual defection, and mutual defection is collectively terrible. This is the core tragedy at the heart of game theory. Individually rational behavior can produce collectively irrational outcomes. Self-interest, pursued by fully rational agents with full information, does not necessarily lead to the best outcome for anyone. The prisoner's dilemma is not just a cute puzzle. It is the mathematical skeleton of some of the most important and destructive problems in human civilization. Why do countries build massive arsenals of weapons they hope they never use? Because the dominant strategy in an arms race is to arm, regardless of what the other side does. Why do fishing nations overfish the oceans even as they watch the fish stocks collapse? Because the dominant strategy for each individual boat is to catch as much as it can, regardless of what the other boats do. Why do cartels fall apart? Because the dominant strategy for each member is to cheat on the agreement and produce more than their quota. The prisoner's dilemma. Everywhere, in everything. Here is something that makes the story of Nash even more remarkable. After his extraordinary early work in the early 1950s, Nash began to deteriorate. He started believing he was receiving messages from extraterrestrials. He believed he was being followed by government agents. He wrote long, incomprehensible letters to foreign embassies. He resigned from MIT, where he had been a faculty member, and began wandering the campus of Princeton, leaving cryptic notes on blackboards. He had developed paranoid schizophrenia, one of the most severe and debilitating mental illnesses known to medicine. For decades, he was in and out of psychiatric institutions. His marriage fell apart. His career, which had been on a trajectory toward the very highest levels of mathematical achievement, effectively ended before he turned 30. He wandered the Princeton campus for years, a ghost of his former self, known to graduate students as the Phantom, scribbling equations on blackboards in the middle of the night. And then, slowly, through a process that Nash himself described as a deliberate decision to reject delusional thinking rather than a medical recovery, he began to come back. He began to publish again. He began to attend seminars. He began to re-enter the mathematical world he had left. In 1994, the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics to Nash, along with John Hassani and Reinhard Selten, for their foundational contributions to game theory. Nash was 66 years old. The prize was, in part, a recognition of the fact that game theory had by then transformed economics, political science, evolutionary biology, and strategic studies across the world. He accepted the prize in Stockholm. He gave a short, gracious speech. He thanked his wife Alicia, who had stood by him through decades of illness. In 2015, he and Alicia were killed in a taxi accident on their way home from the airport after he had just received the Abel Prize, mathematics' highest honour, in Oslo. He was 86 years old. Nash's theorem guaranteed that every finite game has at least one Nash equilibrium. But it said nothing about how many equilibria a game might have. And it said nothing about which equilibrium would actually be played when there are multiple possibilities. This is a much harder problem than it sounds. Consider a simple coordination game. Two drivers are approaching each other on a road. Each must decide which side to drive on. If they both choose the same side, there is no collision. If they choose different sides, there is a crash. There are two Nash equilibria here. Both drive on the left, both drive on the right. Both are perfectly valid equilibria in the mathematical sense. At either one, neither driver has an incentive to deviate. But how do you choose between them? If you live in Britain, you drive on the left. If you live in America, you drive on the right. The equilibrium that gets played is determined not by the mathematics of the game itself, but by history, convention, law, and social expectation. This points to something fundamental. The Nash equilibrium concept tells you what strategic configurations are stable. It does not tell you which stable configuration a society, a market, or a set of players will arrive at. And in many real situations, the choice between equilibria is the entire question of interest. Reinhard Zelton, who shared the 1994 Nobel Prize with Nash, addressed one version of this problem with a concept called the trembling hand perfect equilibrium. The idea is this. Suppose that every player makes mistakes with some small probability. Their hand trembles, as it were, and they occasionally play the wrong strategy by accident. A trembling hand, perfect equilibrium, is a Nash equilibrium that remains stable even when players make these small random mistakes. Equilibria that are not trembling hand perfect can be eliminated as implausible because they rely on players making precise off-equilibrium threats that they would not actually carry out if the situation arose. This is called a refinement of the Nash equilibrium concept. The project of finding better and more precise refinements, better ways of selecting among multiple equilibria, occupied game theorists for the next several decades. Everything we have discussed so far involves what game theorists call simultaneous games. Games where all players make their decisions at the same time without knowing what the others are doing. The prisoner's dilemma is a simultaneous game. The coordination game with two drivers is a simultaneous game. But many of the most important strategic situations in the world are sequential. One player moves first, then another player observes that move and responds. Then the first player observes the response and makes another move, and so on. In sequential games, the order of moves matters enormously, and a new strategic concept becomes critical: credibility. Consider this game. A small startup company is entering a market currently dominated by one large incumbent firm. The incumbent can respond to the entry in one of two ways. It can accommodate the entrant and share the market, or it can wage an aggressive price war to drive the entrant out. The price war is expensive for the incumbent, but if the threat of a price war deters the entrant from entering at all, the incumbent never has to actually fight the war. So the incumbent says to the entrant, "If you enter this market, I will fight you. I will drop my prices, I will undercut you, I will drive you into bankruptcy. Do not enter." Should the entrant believe this threat? The answer depends on whether the threat is credible. If fighting is actually more costly for the incumbent than accommodating, then once the entry has already happened, the incumbent is better off accommodating. The threat to fight was a bluff, and a rational entrant, reasoning backward from what the incumbent will actually do once entry occurs, should call the bluff. This is called backward induction, and it is the key technique for solving sequential games. You start at the end of the game tree. You figure out what each player will do at the last possible decision point, given what has already happened. Then you move backward one step and figure out what each player will do at the second to last decision point, given what they know about what will happen at the last decision point. And you continue backward all the way to the first move. The strategies that survive backward induction form what is called a sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium, and these are the equilibria that game theorists consider most credible for sequential games, because they eliminate Nash equilibria based on threats that would not actually be carried out. Here is one of the most surprising and important results in all of game theory. Suppose the prisoner's dilemma is not played once, but repeated indefinitely. Two players interact with each other over and over, period after period, potentially forever. They know they will interact again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Does this change the game? The answer is one of the most powerful and counterintuitive results in the field, and it is known as the Folk theorem, because it was so widely known and discussed in informal mathematical circles before anyone bothered to write it down formally. The Folk theorem says this: in an infinitely repeated game, if players value the future sufficiently, meaning they care enough about what happens in future rounds relative to what happens today, then almost any average payoff that leaves each player at least as well off as they would be by defecting can be sustained as a Nash equilibrium. In plain language, cooperation can emerge and be sustained in the repeated prisoner's dilemma. The mechanism is simple and devastating in its elegance. If you cooperate today, you get the cooperative payoff today. If you defect today, you might get a higher payoff today, but you trigger retaliation tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. If you care enough about the future, the gains from defecting today are not worth the losses from being punished in all future rounds. So you cooperate, and your partner, facing the same calculation, cooperates too. But here is the disturbing part. The folk theorem does not just say that cooperation is possible. It says that almost everything is possible. There are infinitely many Nash equilibria in the infinitely repeated game. You can sustain cooperation. But you can also sustain any number of other outcomes, including outcomes that are quite bad for everyone, as long as there is a self-enforcing punishment structure that makes deviating worse. The folk theorem tells you that repetition opens up possibility, but it does not tell you which possibility will be realized. The problem of equilibrium selection, the problem of knowing which of the many possible stable outcomes will actually emerge, becomes even harder in repeated games than in one-shot games. So far, we have been assuming that all players in a game know everything relevant about the game they are playing. They know the rules. They know the payoffs. They know the strategies available to each player. The only thing they do not know is what the other players are going to choose. This is called a game of complete information. And while it is a useful abstraction, it is obviously not a description of most real strategic situations. In the real world, you almost never know everything about the other players you are facing. You do not know their precise objectives. You do not know their costs. You do not know their capabilities. You do not know whether they are the kind of person who will cooperate or defect, fight or accommodate, tell the truth or bluff, and they do not know these things about you. Games with this kind of missing information are called games of incomplete information, and they require an entirely different theoretical framework. The framework was invented by John Harsanyi, the third laureate of the 1994 Nobel Prize, and it is one of the most clever and technically sophisticated ideas in all of economic theory. Harsanyi's key insight was this: even when players do not know the relevant private characteristics of other players, we can still build a rigorous model of the strategic situation by thinking about what those players believe about each other. His approach works like this. Each player has a type. A player's type is a complete description of all their private information, their costs, their preferences, their capabilities, everything that is relevant to their strategic behavior that other players cannot observe directly. Before the game begins, nature, treated in the model as a fictional player, draws types for all players from a probability distribution that all players know. Each player observes their own type, but not the types of other players. Each player then has beliefs, represented as probability distributions, over the possible types of other players. And players choose strategies that map their types to actions, choosing the action that maximizes their expected payoff, given their beliefs about what other types of other players are doing. An equilibrium in this framework is called a Bayesian-Nash equilibrium. Bayesian because it uses the framework of Bayesian probability, in which you update your beliefs in response to new information using a rule called Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem tells you how to update your probability estimate for a hypothesis when you receive new evidence. In its simplest form, it says that the probability of your hypothesis being true, given that you observed a particular piece of evidence, equals the probability of observing that evidence if your hypothesis were true, multiplied by the prior probability of your hypothesis, divided by the total probability of observing that evidence across all possible hypotheses. Applied to games. When you see another player take a particular action, you update your beliefs about their type using Bayes' theorem. And a perfect Bayesian-Nash equilibrium requires not only that each player's strategy is optimal given their beliefs, but that their beliefs are consistent with Bayes' theorem whenever possible given what they observe. This sounds complicated. Let us look at what it means in practice. Consider the job market. A firm is trying to hire a worker, but it does not know whether the worker is highly productive or less productive. The worker knows their own productivity, but the firm cannot observe it directly. This is a game of asymmetric information. Now, workers of both types might claim to be highly productive. Claims are cheap. Saying, "I am highly productive," costs nothing. So the firm cannot take such claims at face value. But suppose that getting a college education costs less time, money and effort for highly productive workers than for less productive workers. This might be because highly productive workers find coursework easier, or because the opportunity cost of their time is lower relative to their long-run earnings potential. Whatever the reason, suppose education is just inherently less costly for the high productivity type. In this situation, education can function as a signal. Even if education has no effect whatsoever on actual productivity, a highly productive worker might choose to get educated simply to signal to the firm that they are high productivity, because the firm knows that a less productive worker would not find it worthwhile to incur the same educational cost. This is called a separating equilibrium. In a separating equilibrium, different types of players take different actions, and those actions reveal their types. The firm sees which workers got educated and correctly infers which are high productivity. And this inference is correct in equilibrium, because the strategies that lead to this inference are themselves optimal given the inference. This insight is due to Michael Spence, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001 for this work. And it has deeply unsettling implications. If Spence is right, then a significant portion of the value of education is not about what you learn. It is about what getting the degree signals to employers about your pre-existing capabilities. The credential is a signal, not just a skill accumulator. And the reason it works as a signal is precisely because it is costly. Because if it were easy to get, everyone would get it, and it would no longer be informative. This does not mean education is worthless. Education clearly does teach things. But the signaling model suggests that at least some of the premium workers with college degrees earn over workers without them reflects this signaling function rather than the skills learned in classrooms. Signaling theory applies far beyond the job market. It explains why animals engage in seemingly wasteful displays. The peacock's tail is costly. It makes the peacock slower and more vulnerable to predators. But that is exactly why it is a credible signal of genetic quality. A sickly peacock cannot afford such a tail. Only a genuinely healthy, vigorous peacock can grow one and survive. So the tail is honest, precisely because it is a burden. This is called the handicap principle, developed by the biologist Amos Zahavi. And it is a direct application of signaling theory from economics to evolutionary biology. The flip side of signaling is screening. In signaling, the informed party, the one with private information, takes actions to reveal that information. In screening, the uninformed party, the one who lacks information, designs the rules of the game to get the informed party to reveal themselves. Insurance companies do this constantly. An insurance company does not know whether a particular customer is a high-risk or low-risk driver. If it charges a single price, it will attract too many high-risk customers because high-risk customers value insurance more. This is called adverse selection. Charging a single pooling price makes the insurance pool worse on average, which forces the price up, which drives away more low-risk customers, which makes the pool even worse, in a death spiral of selection that George Akerlof described in his Nobel Prize-winning paper On the Market for Lemons. The solution is a menu of contracts. The insurance company offers a high-deductible, low-premium contract and a low-deductible, high-premium contract simultaneously. High-risk customers will prefer the low-deductible option because they know they are likely to make claims and they want coverage to be generous when they do. Low-risk customers will prefer the high-deductible option because they know they are unlikely to make claims and the low premium is more valuable to them than comprehensive coverage. The customers self-select into the contract that reveals their type. The company designs the menu so that each type prefers the contract intended for them over the contract intended for other types. This is called the incentive compatibility constraint. Each type must prefer what was designed for them. And the individual rationality constraint. Each type must prefer participating to not participating at all. The mathematical theory of optimal mechanism design, figuring out what menu of contracts or rules maximizes the uninformed party's objective while satisfying incentive compatibility and individual rationality, is one of the most technically demanding and practically important areas of modern game theory. Roger Myerson, who shared the 2007 Nobel Prize in Economics, proved fundamental results about optimal mechanism design that are still used today in the design of auctions, contracts, and regulatory policies. An auction is a game. It is one of the most carefully studied games in all of game theory because it has real economic stakes, clear rules, and a structure that lends itself to precise mathematical analysis. But auctions are not all the same. There are many different types of auctions, each with different strategic properties and different outcomes. And the choice of auction format turns out to matter enormously, both for how much the seller receives and for whether the object ends up in the hands of the person who values it most. The four most basic auction formats are these: the English auction, the classic open ascending price auction where bidders call out rising bids until no one is willing to go higher. The Dutch auction, the open descending price auction where the price starts high and drops until someone is willing to buy. The first price sealed bid auction, where bidders submit secret bids and the highest bidder wins and pays their bid. and the second price sealed bid auction, also known as the Vickrey auction, where bidders submit secret bids. The highest bidder wins, but they pay only the second highest bid. These formats can lead to very different strategic behavior. In the first price sealed bid auction, you face a genuine strategic dilemma. You want to bid high enough to win, but if you bid your true value, you earn no profit even if you win. So you shade your bid downward. How much you shade depends on your beliefs about how many other bidders there are and how high they are likely to bid. In the second price Vickrey auction, something remarkable happens. Your dominant strategy is to bid exactly your true value. No shading required. No strategic thinking required. Here is why. If you bid your true value and you win, you pay the second highest bid, which is less than your true value, so you earn a positive profit. If you bid lower than your true value, you might lose auctions you would have been willing to win, costing you profits. If you bid higher than your true value, you might win an auction and pay more than your true value, costing you money. In both cases, deviating from your true value is weakly harmful. Bidding your true value is always weakly optimal. William Vickrey proved this result in 1961 and won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1996 for it. Tragically, he died 3 days after the prize was announced and never gave an acceptance speech. The revenue equivalence theorem, another fundamental result in auction theory, says something even more surprising. Under standard conditions, including risk-neutral bidders with independent private values and symmetric information about the distribution of values, all 4 major auction formats produce the same expected revenue to the seller. This seems almost impossible. The formats look so different. The strategies required are so different. How can they produce the same expected revenue? The answer is that the formats differ in how they extract surplus from bidders, but in ways that exactly cancel out. In a first-price auction, bidders shade their bids so the seller gets a lower fraction of each winner's value. But the winner is still the person with the highest value, so the allocation is equally efficient. The differences in strategic bidding behavior precisely offset each other in expected revenue. But the revenue equivalence theorem requires strong assumptions. When those assumptions fail, different auction formats can produce very different revenues. And designing the right auction format for the right situation is a major practical application of game theory. In the 1990s, the United States government needed to sell licenses for portions of the electromagnetic spectrum to telecommunications companies. These licenses were worth hundreds of billions of dollars combined. Previous allocations had been done by administrative hearings or lotteries, which were slow, inefficient, and often allocated licenses to companies that did not value them most. The Federal Communications Commission turned to game theorists. A team including Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson at Stanford University designed what became known as the simultaneous ascending auction, a format specifically designed for the unique properties of spectrum licenses. The key challenge was that spectrum licenses are complements. A license to broadcast in New York City is worth much more to you if you also have the license for New Jersey and Connecticut, because you can offer seamless coverage across a larger area. If you hold only New York but not New Jersey, your value is much lower. This means bidders face what is called the exposure problem. They might win an incomplete package of licenses at high prices and end up holding something much less valuable than they bid. The simultaneous ascending auction addressed this by allowing all licenses to be bid on simultaneously, with the prices rising in rounds. Bidders could track which licenses they were winning and losing and adjust their bids accordingly. This allowed them to construct complete, complementary packages without being forced to commit to individual licenses independently. The first FCC Spectrum auction, held in 1994, raised approximately $617 million. Subsequent auctions, refined and improved by the game theory team, raised tens of billions of dollars. Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2020, specifically for their contributions to auction theory and the design of new auction formats. This was game theory not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as direct engineering of economic institutions with measurable billion-dollar consequences. The success of Spectrum auctions opened the door to a broader field called market design, or more specifically, mechanism design in practice. The basic idea is that markets are not just natural phenomena that emerge spontaneously. They are institutions with rules, and the rules can be designed to achieve better outcomes. Al Roth, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2012, pioneered the practical application of market design to situations where money cannot directly allocate resources because of legal, ethical, or practical constraints. One of Roth's most celebrated contributions was the redesign of the National Resident Matching Program, which matches medical school graduates to hospital residency programs. The old system had a history of unraveling, with hospitals making early offers to students before the formal match process, and students feeling pressured to accept or reject offers before they had complete information. The market was breaking down. Roth and his colleagues analyzed the matching problem and discovered that the algorithm used by the National Resident Matching Program produces what is called a stable matching. A matching is stable if there is no pair of a student and a hospital, such that the student prefers the hospital over their current assignment, and the hospital prefers the student over their current assignment. A stable matching leaves no mutually beneficial trades on the table. The theory of stable matchings was developed by David Gale and Lloyd Shapley in a 1962 paper that also described the algorithm now known as the Gale-Shapley algorithm, or the deferred acceptance algorithm. Shapley won the Nobel Prize in 2012 for this work. But Roth's contribution was to actually implement this theory in real institutions, to diagnose why markets were failing and redesign them to be stable and efficient. His most dramatic application was the kidney exchange problem. Many patients who need kidney transplants have a willing donor, often a spouse or family member, whose kidney is biologically incompatible with the patient. In a simple bilateral exchange, nothing can be done. But if you could arrange chains and cycles of exchanges across multiple incompatible pairs, you might be able to find a combination of trades where every patient receives a compatible kidney from someone else's donor. Roth and his colleagues designed kidney exchange programs that do exactly this. Using algorithms based on the theory of matching markets, they find chains of exchanges that might involve 3, 4, 5 or more pairs, where each patient gets a compatible kidney even though no simple bilateral swap was possible. These programs now operate in the United States and other countries, and they save thousands of lives every year. This is game theory saving lives, directly, measurably, in real time. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. He described natural selection, the process by which organisms with heritable traits that improve survival and reproduction leave more offspring than those without such traits, causing those traits to spread through a population over generations. Darwin's framework was enormously powerful, but it had one fundamental problem when applied to social behavior. Many animals cooperate with each other. Bees and wasps live in colonies where workers sacrifice their own reproduction to serve a queen. Meerkats take turns standing guard and giving alarm calls that warn the group about predators, at some cost to the individual guard. Vampire bats share blood meals with hungry roost mates, even non-relatives. Humans cooperate in extraordinarily complex and large-scale ways that have no parallel in any other species. How does natural selection, which acts on individuals and their reproductive success, explain behavior that seems to sacrifice individual reproductive success for the benefit of others? This problem troubled biologists for nearly a century after Darwin, and the solution came, to a significant degree, from game theory. The first major breakthrough came from the British biologist W.D. Hamilton in the 1960s. Hamilton asked, when is it evolutionarily advantageous for an organism to help another, even at cost to itself? His answer was elegant and precise. An altruistic act is favored by natural selection when the benefit to the recipient, multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness between actor and recipient, exceeds the cost to the actor. Written as an inequality, R times B must be greater than C. Where R is the coefficient of relatedness, B is the benefit to the recipient in terms of additional offspring produced, and C is the cost to the actor in terms of offspring foregone. The coefficient of relatedness measures the probability that a gene in one individual is identical by descent to a gene in another individual, because both inherited it from a common ancestor. Full siblings share, on average, 1/2 of their genes by descent. Half-siblings share 1/4, cousins share 1/8. Unrelated individuals share 0. So Hamilton's rule says, help your relatives when the benefit to them, weighted by how closely related they are, exceeds the cost to you. Because by helping a close relative reproduce, you are indirectly ensuring the propagation of copies of your own genes. The geneticist J.B.S. Haldane captured this intuition famously when he allegedly said he would lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins, because 2 brothers share 1/2 of his genes on average. So two brothers represent a relatedness-weighted benefit of 2 times 1/2 equals 1, which equals his own genetic contribution of 1. Hamilton called this inclusive fitness theory or kin selection, and it explained the evolution of altruism among relatives beautifully. But it did not explain cooperation among non-relatives. Enter John Maynard Smith, a British biologist who had studied engineering before switching to biology, and who had encountered game theory in the context of economics. Maynard Smith realized that the strategic interactions between animals competing for resources, mates and territory had exactly the structure of games. And he developed a framework for thinking about evolution as a game-theoretic process. The key concept he introduced was the evolutionarily stable strategy, or ESS. Here is the definition. A strategy is evolutionarily stable if a population of individuals all playing that strategy cannot be invaded by any rare mutant playing a different strategy. In other words, when everyone is playing the ESS, a small group of individuals with a different strategy will do worse on average and will gradually be eliminated by natural selection. The ESS is the equilibrium concept for evolution. To see how this works, consider the hawk-dove game, which Maynard Smith used as his central example. Imagine a population of animals competing over a resource, say a piece of food. Each individual can play one of 2 strategies. The hawk strategy: always fight aggressively for the resource, never back down. The dove strategy: display aggressively but back down if the opponent fights. Suppose the value of the resource is worth some number of units of fitness, call it V. Suppose that when 2 hawks meet, they fight, and on average each has a 50% chance of winning. The winner gets V, the loser gets 0, and both incur a cost C from fighting. So the expected payoff to a hawk meeting: another hawk is 1/2 times V minus C. When a hawk meets a dove, the dove backs down. The hawk gets V, the dove gets 0. When 2 doves meet, neither fights. They display for a while, and eventually one gets the resource. On average, each gets 1/2 times V, with a small cost from the display time, call it 0 for simplicity. Now, suppose the population is all doves. A hawk mutant arises. The hawk meets only doves and always wins, getting V. The doves are getting 1/2 times V on average. The hawk does better. Hawk increases in frequency. Suppose the population is all hawks. A dove mutant arises. The dove meets only hawks and always loses, getting 0. The hawks are getting 1/2 times V minus C on average. If V is less than C, meaning the cost of fighting exceeds the value of the resource, then 1/2 times V minus C is negative. The dove gets 0, which is better than a negative number. So dove does better than hawk when hawks are common. Dove increases in frequency. This means that neither all hawk nor all dove is evolutionarily stable when V is less than C. The population will converge to a mixed equilibrium where some fraction plays hawk and the rest play dove. The exact fraction is determined by setting the expected payoffs of hawk and dove equal to each other. At the mixed equilibrium, the fraction playing hawk equals V divided by C. Every individual is indifferent between hawk and dove in terms of expected fitness. And this is evolutionarily stable. No mutant strategy can invade. This is remarkable. Evolution, without any planning, design or conscious thought, arrives at the same mixed equilibrium solution that game theory predicts for rational players. The mathematics of strategic interaction applies to evolutionary biology just as powerfully as it applies to human decision-making. In 1979 and 1980, the political scientist Robert Axelrod ran one of the most famous computer tournaments in the history of social science. He invited game theorists, economists, psychologists, biologists, political scientists, and mathematicians from around the world to submit strategies for playing the repeated prisoner's dilemma against each other. The strategies were computer programs. Each strategy would play against every other strategy, against itself, and against a strategy of random play for 200 rounds. The total score across all interactions would determine the winner. 14 entries were submitted for the first tournament. They ranged from sophisticated, complex strategies with elaborate rules for when to cooperate and when to defect, to simple strategies that always cooperated or always defected. The winner was the simplest strategy submitted. It had only 2 lines of code. It was submitted by the psychologist Anatole Rappaport. It was called tit for tat. Tit for tat works as follows. On the first move, cooperate. On every subsequent move, do whatever your opponent did on the previous move. If they cooperated last time, cooperate this time. If they defected last time, defect this time. That is the entire strategy. Axelrod ran a second tournament with 62 entries, now from players who knew tit for tat had won the first one, and who had submitted more sophisticated strategies designed to beat it. Tit for tat won again. Axelrod analyzed why tit for tat was so successful and identified 4 properties it possessed that seemed to characterize successful strategies. First, niceness. Tit for tat never defects first. It starts with cooperation and never initiates defection. Most of the top-performing strategies in the tournament shared this property. Second, retaliatory. Tit for tat immediately punishes defection. It does not let exploitation go unchallenged. This prevents exploitative strategies from getting too far ahead. Third, forgiving. After punishing a defection, tit for tat returns to cooperation immediately if the opponent cooperates. It does not hold a grudge. This prevents mutually destructive cycles of retaliation from spiraling out of control. Fourth, clear. Tit for tat is completely transparent and easy to understand. Opponents quickly figure out how it works and can calibrate their own behavior accordingly. These results had profound implications. They suggested that cooperation can emerge spontaneously among selfish, self-interested agents through repeated interaction, without any central authority, without any binding agreements, and without any altruism whatsoever. The only requirement is that interactions be repeated, that the future matter, and that the right kind of conditional strategy be available. Axelrod's work, combined with Maynard Smith's ESS framework and Hamilton's kin selection theory, gave biologists and social scientists a powerful new set of tools for understanding how cooperation evolves. The question of cooperation is one of the deepest in all of biology. Natural selection acts on individuals. Cooperation often benefits the group at the expense of the individual. How can group beneficial, individually costly behavior evolve and persist? The game theoretic answer has several complementary parts. Kin selection, as Hamilton showed, explains cooperation among relatives. When you help a close relative, you indirectly propagate your own genes. The coefficient of relatedness transforms individual-level selection into something that can favor apparently altruistic behavior. Reciprocal altruism, a concept developed by the biologist Robert Trivers in 1971, explains cooperation among non-relatives who interact repeatedly. The logic is essentially that of the Folk theorem. If interactions are repeated, if each party can condition their future behavior on past behavior, and if both parties care enough about future interactions, then cooperative strategies can invade and persist. You help me today, I help you tomorrow. Both of us end up better off than if neither of us ever helped anyone. Network reciprocity explains how cooperation can persist even when interactions are not random but are structured by who happens to live near whom. If cooperators tend to interact more with other cooperators because they live in the same neighborhood or belong to the same social group, then cooperation can thrive locally even if it would be invaded by defectors in a globally mixed population. Group selection, the most controversial of the mechanisms, proposes that selection can act at the level of groups as well as individuals. If groups composed of cooperators systematically outperform groups composed of defectors, and if groups can reproduce or spread relative to each other, then cooperation at the individual level might be favored even if it is costly to the individual because it benefits the group. This mechanism remains debated, but recent work has clarified the conditions under which it can be significant. And cultural group selection, a mechanism specific to humans, proposes that human social norms, institutions and beliefs can evolve by a process analogous to natural selection, with groups whose cultural norms promote cooperation outcompeting and eventually replacing groups with less cooperative norms. This mechanism may explain the extraordinary scale of human cooperation, which far exceeds that of any other species. In the years immediately following World War II, a group of economists, mathematicians, and strategic analysts gathered in a new research institution in Santa Monica, California, called the RAND Corporation. RAND stood for Research and Development. It was funded primarily by the United States Air Force, and its mission was to apply scientific methods, including the newly developed framework of game theory, to the most urgent strategic question of the nuclear age. The question was this: how do you prevent nuclear war? It sounds like a question for diplomats, for politicians, for philosophers of ethics. And it is all of those things. But it is also, at its core, a game theory problem. It is a problem about strategic interaction between two players with conflicting interests, incomplete information about each other's intentions, and the ability to choose strategies that could lead to outcomes ranging from peaceful coexistence to mutual annihilation. The RAND analysts recognized that the nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union was, in formal game theoretic terms, a repeated game of incomplete information with multiple equilibria, enormous stakes, and the peculiar feature that the worst possible outcome, nuclear war, was bad for both players, even the one who technically won. And they began to think about it with the mathematical tools that game theory provided. The doctrine that eventually emerged from both American and Soviet strategic thinking, and that came to define the nuclear standoff for most of the Cold War, was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic of MAD is pure game theory. And it is, in a certain light, one of the most macabre and yet effective equilibrium concepts ever conceived. Here is the basic structure. Both the United States and the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons capable of destroying the other. If either side launches a first strike against the other side retains sufficient surviving weapons to retaliate and destroy the attacker. This is called second strike capability. And it is crucial. Given second strike capability, launching a first strike is irrational. You might destroy your enemy, but your enemy will destroy you in the process. The expected outcome of launching first is your own annihilation. So launching first is dominated by not launching, regardless of what the other side does, as long as you maintain second strike capability. The Nash equilibrium of MAD is mutual non-launch. Neither side attacks, not because they like each other, not because they trust each other, not because they have made any binding agreement, but because launching is contrary to their own interests, given what the other side will do in response. This is a Nash equilibrium in a very literal sense. Given that the other side is not launching, you are better off not launching. Given that you are not launching, the other side is better off not launching. Neither side has an incentive to deviate from non-attack, given the strategy of the other. The equilibrium is stable, and it held for over 40 years. But here is what makes MAD genuinely terrifying, and what RAND analysts like Thomas Schelling spent their careers trying to understand. The stability of the equilibrium depends entirely on the credibility of the threat to retaliate. If your opponent believes that you would never actually retaliate, because retaliation after you have been hit means more death for everyone and serves no instrumental purpose, then the deterrent fails. The threat must be credible to be effective. And making a threat credible when the threat itself is suicidal is one of the hardest problems in strategic theory. Thomas Schelling was an economist who spent much of his career thinking about exactly this problem. His two books, The Strategy of Conflict, published in 1960, and Arms and Influence, published in 1966, are among the most important works in strategic studies ever written. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005. Schelling's central insight was that credibility in deterrence is not about making threats and having the willpower to carry them out. It is about manipulating the strategic structure of the situation so that carrying out the threat becomes, in some sense, automatic or nearly automatic. One of his key concepts was the manipulation of risk. Schelling argued that in nuclear brinkmanship, what matters is not simply whether you are willing to fight a nuclear war, but how much risk you are willing to impose on the other side. The question is not all or nothing. It is a matter of degrees and probabilities. A credible nuclear deterrent, he argued, does not require the certainty of retaliation. It requires the risk of retaliation. Specifically, it requires that the expected cost to the aggressor of provoking a conflict be high enough that aggression is not worthwhile, accounting for the probability that retaliation will occur, even if it seems irrational ex post. This is because nuclear decisions are not made by perfectly rational calculating machines, but by human beings operating under stress, with limited information, subject to organizational pressures, domestic political constraints, and the fog of war. Even if a perfectly rational leader might choose not to retaliate after being struck, real leaders operating in real political environments might retaliate anyway. The probability is not zero, and if the expected destruction from a nuclear exchange is enormous, even a small probability of triggering that exchange is a massive expected cost. Schelling called this the threat that leaves something to chance. You do not threaten certain retaliation. You create a situation in which the risk of retaliation is substantial enough to deter attack, without requiring any individual to commit to a suicidal act with certainty. The concept of commitment devices flows directly from this. One way to make a threat credible is to remove your own ability to back down. If you can irreversibly commit to retaliating in the event of an attack, perhaps by installing automatic launch systems that fire without human authorization once certain conditions are met, then the threat becomes credible because it removes the aggressor's hope that you will choose not to retaliate in the moment. The Soviet Union actually built a version of such a system called perimeter, informally known in the West as dead hand. It was an automated nuclear control system designed to ensure a retaliatory strike even if the entire Soviet military and political leadership had been destroyed in a first strike. Whether the system actually worked as designed has never been fully confirmed. But the intent was exactly what Schelling's theory predicted. Make the retaliatory threat automatic, remove the option of restraint, and thereby maximize the credibility of deterrence. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was the closest the world came to nuclear war. It was also, in retrospect, one of the most elaborate and high-stakes games of chicken ever played between two nuclear powers. And Schelling's framework of brinkmanship, credibility, and the manipulation of risk provides, to this day, the clearest analytical lens through which to understand what happened. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War is another classical game theoretic tragedy. The structure is a prisoner's dilemma on a massive scale. Both countries are better off if neither builds massive arsenals. The money spent on weapons could be used for education, infrastructure, medicine, economic development. And the security gains from having more weapons are offset, more or less, by the fact that the other side also has more weapons. You are not more secure relative to your opponent if you both build up simultaneously. But disarmament is the dominated strategy. If the Soviets disarm and the United States does not, the United States gains an enormous military advantage. If the United States disarms and the Soviets do not, the Soviets gain an enormous military advantage. In either case, disarming unilaterally is catastrophic. So both sides arm, regardless of what the other does. The Nash equilibrium is mutual armament, which is collectively worse than mutual disarmament. The only way out of this trap is arms control agreements. Treaties that create a binding commitment by both sides to limit their arsenals. Arms control works when it works because it changed the game. It transforms the one-shot prisoner's dilemma into a repeated game with enforceable agreements, verification mechanisms, and consequences for defection. The agreements, if credible and verifiable, shift the equilibrium from mutual armament toward mutual restraint. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and subsequent arms control agreements were all, in game-theoretic terms, attempts to solve the prisoner's dilemma of nuclear armament by creating the conditions under which cooperative equilibria could be sustained. So far, we have been building our entire analysis on a foundation that, it turns out, is not entirely real. The foundation is the assumption of rationality. In game theory, a rational player is one who has a well-defined set of preferences over outcomes, who can calculate expected payoffs, and who always chooses the strategy that maximizes their own expected payoff given their beliefs about what other players are doing. This is an extraordinarily powerful assumption. It allows the entire mathematical machinery of game theory to work. But it is also, in many respects, obviously false as a description of how real human beings actually behave. And here is the uncomfortable truth. When you take game theory into the laboratory, when you recruit real human subjects, put them in carefully controlled game-theoretic situations, measure what they actually do, and compare it to what rational game theory predicts, you often find substantial and systematic deviations. This is the domain of behavioral game theory, and it has produced some of the most surprising and important findings in modern social science. Consider the ultimatum game. It is one of the most widely replicated experiments in economics, and its results have disturbed economists since it was first run in the 1980s. Here is how it works. 2 players. Player 1 is given a sum of money, say $100. Player 1 must propose a division of this money between themselves and Player 2. Player 2 can accept or reject the offer. If Player 2 accepts, both players receive the proposed amounts. If Player 2 rejects, both players receive nothing. Game theory's prediction is clear. A rational Player 2 will accept any positive offer because any amount of money is better than nothing. Knowing this, a rational Player 1 will offer the minimum possible amount, perhaps $1, and keep $99 for themselves. Player 2 accepts the $1. Both players walk away. What actually happens? Real Player 1s typically offer 40 to 50% of the money. Offers below 20% are rejected by Player 2 roughly half of the time or more. The lower the offer, the higher the rejection rate. Many player twos will sacrifice their own payoff rather than accept what they perceive as an unfair offer. Across hundreds of experiments in dozens of countries with real money at stake, the rational prediction fails, systematically, and not just a little, dramatically. Player ones do not maximize their own payoff. They offer far more than rationality requires. Player twos do not maximize their own payoff. They reject positive offers rather than accept ones they find insulting. This is not irrational in some deeper sense. People have preferences over fairness, not just money. They care about how they are treated, about social norms, about reciprocity. They are willing to pay a cost to punish perceived unfairness. These preferences are real and important, but they are not captured by the standard rational choice model. The dictator game is a simpler variant. Player one proposes a division of the money, and player two has no choice but to accept. There is no strategic interaction. Player two cannot reject. So the rational prediction is even clearer. Player one should keep everything. What actually happens? Player ones give away, on average, around 20 to 30% of the money, even though they face no strategic reason to do so. Many give 50%. Very few keep everything. This suggests that the generosity observed in the ultimatum game is not entirely strategic, not just a response to the fear of rejection. People have genuine preferences for fairness and giving, not just instrumentally, but intrinsically. Ernst Fehr and Simon Gechter, in a series of elegant experiments, showed something even more striking. They found evidence for altruistic punishment, which means punishment of norm violators at personal cost to the punisher, even in situations with no possibility of future interaction or reputation effects. People will pay to punish others who they perceive as cheating or free-riding, even when the punishment costs them personally and provides them no direct benefit. This suggests that humans may have evolved psychological mechanisms for enforcing social norms, mechanisms that lead them to punish selfish behavior even at personal cost. These mechanisms, however they evolved, might be essential for the large-scale cooperation that characterizes human societies, and they represent a fundamental departure from the rational actor model. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, in their landmark 1979 paper introducing prospect theory, documented a systematic pattern in how people evaluate risky choices that deviates dramatically from what rational expected utility theory predicts. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for this and related work. Tversky would almost certainly have shared the prize had he not died in 1996. Prospect theory has several core components, each of which represents a departure from rational choice. First, reference dependence. People evaluate outcomes not in absolute terms, but relative to a reference point, typically the status quo or a recent expectation. A gain of $100 feels different if it is a windfall versus if you were expecting $500 and only got $100. Second, loss aversion. The pain of losing $100 is approximately twice as large as the pleasure of gaining $100 in terms of psychological impact on decision-making. This means people are much more motivated to avoid losses than to acquire equivalent gains. Losses loom larger than gains. Third, diminishing sensitivity. The difference between gaining $0 and gaining $100 feels much larger than the difference between gaining $1,000 and gaining $1,100, even though both differences are $100. Utility diminishes at the margin in both the gain domain and the loss domain. Fourth, probability weighting. People do not weight probabilities linearly. They overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. A 1% chance of winning $1 million feels more than 1% as good as the certainty of winning $10,000, which is what a linear probability weighting would imply. This explains why people simultaneously buy insurance against unlikely disasters and lottery tickets for unlikely jackpots. These four properties, when incorporated into a model of strategic decision-making, produce predictions that are systematically different from those of rational game theory. And in many cases, these predictions are more accurate descriptions of what real people actually do. The insights of behavioral game theory have had enormous practical implications, generating a field sometimes called behavioral economics or nudge theory. If people systematically deviate from rationality in predictable ways, then you can design institutions, policies, and choice environments that account for these deviations, either to correct for them or to harness them for better outcomes. Consider retirement savings. Rational individuals should calculate their optimal savings rate, taking into account expected future income, investment returns, tax effects, and consumption preferences. In practice, many people save far less than is in their own long-term interest. They procrastinate. They focus on the present at the expense of the future. They find the calculations overwhelming and do nothing. Richard Thaler and Shlomo Bernartzi designed a program called Save More Tomorrow. The key innovation was to change the default. Instead of requiring employees to actively opt into a savings plan, the program automatically enrolled employees and automatically increased their savings rate with each future raise. Employees could opt out at any time, but they rarely did. By changing the default and exploiting the psychological tendency toward inertia, the program dramatically increased retirement savings with no change in the actual options available to employees. Thaler won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 for this and related work on behavioral economics. Default effects, framing effects, social norms, and other behavioral insights have now been incorporated into policy design in dozens of countries. The British government created a behavioral insights team in 2010, sometimes called the Nudge Unit, to systematically apply behavioral science to public policy. Similar units have been established in the United States, Australia, Germany, and many other countries. This is game theory and behavioral economics moving from the laboratory and the theorist's whiteboard into direct application in the real world. A network is a set of nodes connected by edges. That is the abstract mathematical definition. But networks are one of the most powerful and universal structural concepts in all of science. The internet is a network. The power grid is a network. Social relationships are networks. Trade routes are networks. The neurons in your brain form a network. The proteins in a cell interact in a network. Disease spreads through networks. Information spreads through networks. Influence spreads through networks. And strategic interactions happen on networks. The games people play are not played in an anonymous soup of all against all. They are played on structured networks of relationships where who you interact with depends on who you are connected to. Network game theory, which has emerged as a major field in the last 2 decades, studies how the structure of networks shapes strategic behavior and outcomes. Consider a telecommunications network. The value of being connected to the network depends on how many other people are also connected. If only 10 people have telephones, having a telephone is not very valuable. If 10 million people have telephones, having a telephone is extremely valuable. This is called a network effect or a network externality. Network effects create strong coordination pressures. If everyone expects a particular technology or platform to become dominant, it is rational to adopt that technology, even if a different one might be technically superior. The expectation of dominance becomes self-fulfilling. This is why VHS beat Betamax in the 1980s, despite Betamax arguably being the better technology. It is why Microsoft Windows became the dominant operating system, despite other systems having advocates who argued they were superior. It is why Facebook, despite many challenges and competitors, remained dominant in social networking for so long. Network effects create winner-take-all markets because there is a strong force pushing users toward whichever platform has the most other users. And this creates enormous first-mover advantages. If you can establish dominance early, the network effects make it very hard for competitors to displace you later. From a game theoretic perspective, markets with strong network effects often have multiple Nash equilibria. One equilibrium is everyone using platform A. Another is everyone using platform B. Both are stable. If everyone is on platform A, each individual prefers to be on platform A because that is where everyone else is. History, chance, and early moves determine which equilibrium gets selected. Disease, information, behavior, and financial crises all spread through networks. And the spread follows game theoretic logic. In a model of social contagion, each person in a network decides whether to adopt some behavior based on what fraction of their neighbors have adopted it. If the fraction of your neighbors who have adopted exceeds some threshold, you adopt. Otherwise, you do not. The structure of the network, specifically how densely connected it is, whether it has clusters or bridges, whether there are a few highly connected hubs or many nodes with similar connectivity, determines whether contagion spreads widely or dies out. A network with tightly knit clusters and sparse connections between clusters can be very resistant to the spread of new behaviors across cluster boundaries, even if individual adoption is easy within clusters. A network with a few highly connected hubs can experience rapid, explosive contagion once a hub adopts, because the hub reaches many nodes simultaneously. The study of contagion in networks has direct applications to public health, where understanding how diseases spread through social contact networks can guide vaccination strategies. To finance, where understanding how bank exposures to each other create the potential for cascading failures can guide regulatory design. And to marketing, where understanding social influence networks can help companies identify the people whose adoption most effectively triggers broader spread. In social networks, not all positions are created equal. Nodes that sit between different clusters, connecting groups that would otherwise be unconnected, have a special kind of structural power. They control the flow of information, resources and influence between the groups they bridge. The sociologist Ronald Burt developed this idea under the name structural holes. A structural hole is the absence of a connection between two parts of a network. A person who bridges a structural hole, who connects otherwise disconnected groups, occupies what Burt calls a broker position. Brokers have strategic advantages. They hear information from one group that the other group has not heard, and vice versa. They can translate ideas between groups, import innovations from one context to another. They can mediate disputes between groups, and their mediation is valuable because removing them would sever connections both groups depend on. In game theoretic terms, the broker has leverage because both groups need them, giving them a favorable bargaining position. The structural position confers power independent of any individual characteristics. Being in the right place in the network is more important than being the most skilled or most knowledgeable person in it. This has been confirmed empirically across many contexts. People who occupy broker positions in corporate social networks are more likely to be promoted, earn higher salaries, and have their ideas adopted. Countries that occupy broker positions in international trade networks have more geopolitical influence than their raw economic size would predict. The network position is a form of social capital with measurable consequences. In May 2016, a computer program called AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in the history of the game, 4 games to 1. Go is an ancient Chinese board game. It is played on a 19 by 19 grid. Each player places black or white stones on intersections of the grid, trying to surround and capture the other stones and territory. The rules are simple. The strategy is of such depth and complexity that it was long considered the last great game at which computers could not beat the best humans. Chess had fallen. In 1997, Deep Blue, a computer built by IBM, defeated the world chess champion Garry Kasparov. But chess, despite its enormous complexity, has a branching factor, meaning the average number of possible moves at each point in the game of around 35. Computer search algorithms can handle this if supplemented by good evaluation functions that estimate the value of a position. Go has a branching factor of around 250. The number of possible Go positions exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. Brute force search is completely infeasible. For decades, computer Go programs were barely competitive with amateur human players, let alone professionals. AlphaGo changed everything. It used a combination of deep neural networks and Monte Carlo tree search, trained both on a database of human expert games and through playing millions of games against itself. The neural networks learned to evaluate board positions and predict likely moves. The tree search used these evaluations to guide exploration of promising lines of play. And through self-play, the system improved beyond the level of any human training data. AlphaGo Zero, the successor program trained entirely through self-play with no human game data, surpassed AlphaGo in 3 days. It discovered strategies that human players had not found in thousands of years of Go history. Game theory and artificial intelligence have always been deeply intertwined. The first AI program, written by Christopher Strachey in 1951, played checkers. Early work on AI and on game theory shared both personnel and intellectual frameworks. But the relationship has deepened dramatically in the last decade. Modern AI systems routinely solve game-theoretic problems of enormous complexity. And the techniques they use are, at their heart, computational implementations of game-theoretic concepts. Computing Nash equilibria for small simple games is straightforward. For two-player zero-sum games, the minimax theorem guarantees that the optimal strategy can be found by solving a linear program. This is computationally efficient. For general non-zero-sum games with multiple players, finding Nash equilibria is computationally hard. The problem of computing a Nash equilibrium falls into a computational complexity class called PPAD complete, which is widely believed to be harder than polynomial time, but easier than the hardest problems in computer science. In practical terms, this means that for large games, you cannot simply compute the Nash equilibrium directly. You need approximation algorithms. Counterfactual regret minimization, or CFR, is one of the most important such algorithms. It is an iterative procedure in which, at each step, a player updates their strategy to reduce regret, where regret is defined as the difference between what they actually earned and what they would have earned by playing a different strategy throughout the game. Surprisingly, CFR converges to an approximate Nash equilibrium in extensive form games, meaning sequential games with imperfect information like poker. In 2015, a program called Claudico, developed by researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, played poker against professional players. It held its own, but did not clearly win. In 2017, a successor program called Libratus, also from Carnegie Mellon, defeated the top 4 professional heads-up No Limit Texas Hold'em players over 20 days of competition. It played 120,000 hands. It won by a margin considered statistically decisive. Poker is fundamentally a game of incomplete information. You cannot see your opponent's cards. You must make decisions under uncertainty while simultaneously managing your own information leakage. Bluffing, value betting, check raising. These are all strategic moves whose optimal frequencies are precisely calculated by game-theoretic analysis. Libratus played a near-perfect game-theoretically optimal strategy, and it was enough to beat the best humans. The most important frontier in the intersection of game theory and artificial intelligence is multi-agent AI. The study and development of systems in which multiple AI agents interact with each other, competing and cooperating in complex environments. When multiple AI agents interact, they are playing games. And the game theoretic concepts we have been discussing, Nash equilibrium, repeated game cooperation, mechanism design, signaling, all become directly relevant to understanding and designing these systems. Self-driving cars provide a concrete example. Multiple self-driving cars navigating the same intersection are playing a coordination game. Each car must predict what the others will do and choose its own action accordingly. If all cars are programmed to maximize their own travel time without coordination, you might get gridlock. If they can communicate and reach a coordinated solution, everyone gets through faster. Designing the algorithms that govern this multi-agent interaction requires game theoretic analysis. Generative adversarial networks, or GANs, one of the most important innovations in deep learning, are explicitly framed as a two-player zero-sum game. A generator network tries to produce images that are indistinguishable from real images. A discriminator network tries to distinguish real images from generated ones. The two networks are trained against each other, in a loop, each improving in response to the other. The Nash equilibrium of this game, where the generator produces perfect images and the discriminator cannot distinguish them, is the theoretical ideal toward which training converges. Reinforcement learning, the framework in which AI agents learn by interacting with an environment and receiving rewards or penalties, becomes multi-agent reinforcement learning when multiple agents are interacting simultaneously. Understanding how agents learn to cooperate or compete, whether they converge to Nash equilibria, and under what conditions stable and efficient multi-agent behavior emerges, are among the most active research questions in both AI and game theory today. OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and other AI research organizations have run multi-agent experiments where populations of AI agents develop sophisticated strategic behaviors through self-play, sometimes discovering strategies that no human had anticipated and that are not easily interpretable even to the researchers who built the systems. We are building systems that play games we do not fully understand. And understanding those games and understanding what equilibria they converge to may be one of the most important scientific challenges of the coming decades. In 1951, the economist Kenneth Arrow published a result that should have broken social science. Arrow asked a simple question: is there a method for combining the individual preferences of all members of a society into a single social preference ordering that satisfies certain basic reasonable criteria? The criteria he proposed seemed entirely reasonable. Unanimity. If every individual prefers option A to option B, then the social ordering should also prefer A to B. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. The social ranking of any two options, A and B, should depend only on how individuals rank A relative to B and not on how they rank a third option. C. Non-dictatorship. There should be no single individual whose preferences always determine the social ranking, regardless of what anyone else prefers. These seem like the minimum requirements for any fair democratic decision-making procedure. And Arrow proved that no voting system can satisfy all three of them simultaneously when there are three or more alternatives. This is Arrow's impossibility theorem. It is one of the most important and disturbing results in all of social science. If you want unanimity and independence of irrelevant alternatives, you must accept a dictator. If you want unanimity and non-dictatorship, you must violate independence of irrelevant alternatives. If you want non-dictatorship and independence of irrelevant alternatives, you must sometimes violate unanimity. There is no escape. The practical implication is that every voting system has fundamental flaws. Plurality voting, the system used in most American elections where each voter casts one vote and the candidate with the most votes wins, violates independence of irrelevant alternatives dramatically. Adding a third candidate who has no chance of winning can change which of the two main candidates wins by splitting the vote. This is the spoiler effect. Ranked choice voting, also called instant runoff voting, violates a different criterion. Under ranked choice, it is possible for a candidate to lose even when a majority of voters prefer them to every other candidate individually if the vote transfers happen in the wrong order. No system is perfect. Arrow's theorem guarantees this. And understanding the specific ways in which different systems fail is the starting point for choosing the system whose failures are least damaging in a given context. Arrow's theorem has a game-theoretic consequence. Every non-dictatorial voting system that satisfies unanimity is manipulable. This result was proved by Alan Gibbard and Mark Satterthwaite independently in the 1970s and is known as the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem. Manipulability means that there exist situations where a voter can achieve a better outcome, as measured by their own preferences by voting strategically rather than truthfully. In other words, misrepresenting your preferences can sometimes help you. This is a familiar phenomenon. In a plurality election, where your favourite candidate has no chance of winning, you might vote for your second favourite candidate who has a realistic chance to prevent your least favourite candidate from winning. This is strategic voting. It is rational, and the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem says it is unavoidable in any reasonable voting system. Strategic voting creates complex game-theoretic interactions. Each voter's optimal strategy depends on what other voters are doing. The equilibria of the voting game can diverge significantly from what you would see if everyone voted truthfully. And the outcome can end up quite far from any reasonable notion of what the voters actually wanted collectively. This has practical implications for electoral design. Systems that make strategic voting harder tend to produce outcomes that better reflect voters' true preferences. Proportional representation systems, where the fraction of seats won by a party reflects its fraction of the vote, give voters less reason to vote strategically than winner-take-all systems. But they create other strategic problems in the coalition formation process that follows elections, where parties bargain over government formation in ways that are themselves complex game-theoretic problems. Once an election produces a legislature, the legislature must govern. And governing in a parliamentary system typically requires building a coalition of parties with a combined majority. The game of coalition formation is a cooperative game, and its analysis reveals something surprising. Political power is not simply proportional to seat share. Consider a parliament with three parties. Party A has 50 seats. Party B has 49 seats. Party C has 1 seat. A majority requires 51 seats. Now, which coalitions have a majority? A plus B together have 99 seats, a majority. A plus C together have 51 seats, a majority. B plus C together have 50 seats, not a majority. Notice something. Party C, with just 1 seat, is a pivotal player. Party C can make either A or B a majority partner. Without C, neither A alone nor B alone has a majority. With C, both A and B can govern. This makes C extremely powerful in coalition negotiations, despite having only 1% of the seats. This is captured by a concept called the Banzhaf Power Index, which measures a party's power by counting how often it is a swing voter in hypothetical voting on legislation. A party's Banzhaf power is the fraction of all possible voting outcomes in which the party is decisive, meaning the outcome would change if that party switched sides. The Banzhaf Index and similar power indices reveal that in many legislative bodies, voting power is distributed very differently from seat share. Small parties in pivotal positions can wield power far exceeding their size, and large parties can sometimes wield less power than their size suggests, because they are rarely pivotal when they are nearly always on the winning side. In 1968, the ecologist Garrett Hardin published a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. It introduced a concept that has become one of the most influential ideas in environmental economics, resource management and public policy. The idea is simple. Imagine a pasture open to all. Each herder can graze their cattle on the commons. Each herder has an incentive to add more cattle, because the benefit from adding one more cow, the milk, the meat, the income it generates, goes entirely to that herder. But the cost of adding one more cow, the degradation of the pasture from overgrazing, is shared among all the herders. So the private benefit of adding a cow exceeds the private cost, even when the social cost shared across everyone exceeds the social benefit. Every herder faces this calculation. Every herder adds more cattle. The pasture is overgrazed. It collapses. Everyone loses. The tragedy of the commons is a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. Individual rationality leads to collective catastrophe. And Hardin argued that this is the fundamental structure of all common pool resource problems: fisheries, aquifers, the atmosphere, biodiversity. When resources are held in common, they tend to be overexploited. Hardin's proposed solutions were either privatization, give each herder their own portion of the pasture so they internalize the cost of degradation, or coercion, government regulation that limits how much each herder can use. But in 1990, the political scientist Elinor Ostrom published a book called Governing the Commons that challenged Hardin's framework profoundly. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for this work. Ostrom studied dozens of real communities that had managed common pool resources successfully for centuries without privatization and without external government regulation. Swiss mountain farmers, Japanese coastal fishing communities, Spanish irrigation communities. The villagers of Turbel in Switzerland had been managing their alpine pastures under a common system since 1294. No tragedy, no collapse. What Ostrom found was that successful commons management depended on specific institutional features that the communities had developed over time. Clear rules defining who has the right to use the resource and how much. Local rules adapted to local conditions rather than imposed from outside. Monitoring by people accountable to users. Graduated sanctions that start mild and escalate for repeat violators. Accessible, low-cost mechanisms for resolving disputes. Recognition by external authorities of the community's right to self-govern. And for larger systems, nested governance with multiple levels of linked institutions. These are game-theoretic institutions. They transform the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma of the unmanaged commons into a repeated game with enforcement, monitoring and sanctions, exactly the conditions under which the folk theorem says cooperation can emerge and be sustained. Ostrom's work showed that the choice is not just between market and government. A third way, community-based governance of commons, can work when the right institutional conditions are in place. And understanding what those conditions are requires exactly the kind of game-theoretic analysis of strategic interaction that this documentary has been building toward. Climate change is the largest and most consequential tragedy of the commons that humanity has ever faced. The atmosphere is a global commons. Every country that burns fossil fuels emits greenhouse gases into this commons. The cost of emission, global warming, rising sea levels, extreme weather, ecosystem disruption is shared across all countries and all future generations. The benefit of emission, cheap energy, industrial production, economic growth goes primarily to the country doing the emitting. This is a global multiplayer prisoner's dilemma with nearly 200 players. Each country has a dominant strategy to emit, regardless of what other countries do. If other countries cut emissions, you benefit from their restraint without cutting your own. If other countries do not cut emissions, unilateral restraint harms your economy without meaningfully reducing global temperature. The Nash equilibrium is high emissions. The collective outcome is catastrophic warming. International climate agreements attempt to solve this problem by transforming it from a one-shot game into a repeated game with enforcement and monitoring. The Paris Agreement of 2015 committed countries to nationally determined contributions to emissions reduction, with a mechanism for periodic review and ratcheting up of ambitions. But the agreement lacks strong enforcement mechanisms. Countries that defect face reputational costs, but few concrete penalties. Game theory suggests that effective climate cooperation requires either strong enforcement mechanisms that make defection costly, or side payments that make cooperation financially attractive even for countries that would otherwise prefer to free ride, or norms and reputation effects strong enough to sustain cooperation in the absence of formal enforcement. Designing institutions that can achieve this at a global scale with nearly 200 sovereign nations is one of the most difficult mechanism design problems in history. Some economists have proposed a global carbon price, or tax, with trade penalties on goods from countries that do not comply, as a way of creating sufficiently strong enforcement. Others have proposed technology agreements where rich countries fund clean technology transfer to developing nations, making cooperation financially attractive across the development spectrum. These are all, at their core, mechanism design proposals attempting to solve a global game-theoretic problem. You want to buy a car. The dealer wants to sell it. There is a range of prices at which a deal is mutually beneficial. The final price depends on bargaining. But how does bargaining work? What determines who walks away with more of the surplus? John Nash, the same Nash who gave us the Nash equilibrium, also made the first rigorous mathematical contribution to bargaining theory in a 1950 paper simply called The Bargaining Problem. Nash characterized the solution to the bargaining problem axiomatically. He proposed 4 axioms that any reasonable bargaining solution should satisfy, and showed that there is exactly one solution satisfying all 4 axioms. The axioms are these. First, Pareto efficiency. The agreement should not leave any mutual gains on the table. If there is a different agreement that both parties prefer, they should reach that agreement instead. Second, invariance to affine transformations of utility. If you change the units in which either player's payoff is measured, the solution should not change in any substantive way. Third, symmetry. If the 2 players are in a completely symmetric situation, the agreement should split the surplus equally. Fourth, independence of irrelevant alternatives. If you remove agreements from the feasible set that would not have been chosen anyway, the solution should not change. Nash proved that the unique bargaining solution satisfying these 4 axioms is the one that maximizes the product of the 2 players' gains from agreement relative to their respective disagreement payoffs. This is now called the Nash bargaining solution. The Nash bargaining solution has a beautiful geometric interpretation. In the space of possible payoff allocations, the solution is the point on the Pareto frontier, the boundary of feasible efficient agreements that maximizes the product of the 2 parties' gains over their outside options. Ariel Rubinstein, in a 1982 paper, derived a similar result from a completely different direction. Instead of axioms, he modeled bargaining as an explicit dynamic game where 2 players alternate making offers and each player discounts future payoffs. Waiting is costly, and Rubinstein showed that this game has a unique sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium, in which the first player makes an offer and the second player immediately accepts. The split of the surplus is determined by the 2 players' discount factors, which reflect their respective impatience. A crucial insight of Rubinstein's model is that bargaining power comes from patience. The more patient you are, meaning the less you discount future payoffs, the better the deal you can extract, because you can credibly wait for a better offer. And the more your opponent discounts the future, the more they need to settle quickly, and the worse their terms will be. This explains why strike funds matter in labour negotiations. A union with a well-funded strike fund can maintain a work stoppage longer. It is more patient. And patience translates directly into bargaining power. It explains why countries under economic sanctions sometimes negotiate from a position of desperation that undermines their bargaining position. Sanctions reduce the sanction recipient's patience by imposing immediate costs, shifting the bargaining equilibrium in favour of the sanctioning country. Ronald Coase, in a 1960 paper titled The Problem of Social Cost, proved a result that is often summarized as, if transaction costs are zero and property rights are well defined, parties will always negotiate to the efficient outcome, regardless of who initially holds the property rights. This is the Coase theorem, and it is one of the most important and most misunderstood results in economics. Consider a factory that pollutes a river, harming a fisherman downstream. The pollution is a negative externality. The factory imposes a cost on the fisherman that is not reflected in the factory's private cost-benefit calculation. Traditional economic analysis says this market failure requires government intervention, perhaps a tax on pollution. Coase said, wait. If the factory and the fisherman can bargain freely, and if there are no transaction costs, they will reach an agreement that is efficient regardless of the initial legal situation. Suppose the fisherman has the legal right to clean water. The factory must either stop polluting or compensate the fisherman. If the factory's profit from polluting exceeds the fisherman's loss, the factory will pay the fisherman to accept some pollution. The outcome is efficient. Pollution occurs up to the point where the marginal benefit to the factory equals the marginal cost to the fisherman. Now, suppose the factory has the legal right to pollute. If the fisherman's loss from pollution exceeds the factory's profit from polluting, the fisherman will pay the factory to reduce pollution. Again, the outcome is efficient. The initial assignment of rights affects who pays whom, but not whether the efficient outcome is reached, as long as bargaining is costless. The Coase theorem is primarily important for what it implies about when government intervention is necessary. Government intervention to correct externalities is justified not simply because externalities exist, but because the transaction costs of private bargaining are high enough that private parties cannot negotiate their way to the efficient outcome on their own. When parties are many, when they are geographically dispersed, when information is asymmetric, when legal agreements are hard to enforce, transaction costs are high and private bargaining fails. These are the situations that justify policy intervention. Climate change is an extreme example. The parties affected by greenhouse gas emissions number in the billions. The emitters also number in the billions. The transaction costs of private bargaining are essentially infinite. Coase's theorem confirms that private bargaining will not solve climate change and that collective action, whether through government policy or international agreements, is the only path. Wars are costly. They kill soldiers and civilians. They destroy infrastructure, businesses, families and societies. They consume enormous amounts of resources on both sides. If both parties to a conflict know the likely outcome before fighting, Both would prefer to reach the same outcome without fighting, saving all that destruction. Why then do wars happen? This is a question that game theory has made significant progress on, and the answers are not what you might expect. The basic insight is due to James Fearon, a political scientist at Stanford. In a 1995 paper titled Rationalist Explanations for War, Fearon argued that purely rational actors with full information should almost never go to war, because the costs of war make a negotiated settlement preferable to both sides. Wars happen, he argued, because of specific failures in the bargaining process, each of which can be understood game theoretically. The first failure is private information. If each side has private information about its own military capabilities, resolve, and the costs it is willing to absorb, it has an incentive to misrepresent this information to extract better terms in negotiation. But if both sides misrepresent, the negotiations may break down, and war becomes the outcome even though both sides would have preferred a negotiated settlement if information were symmetric. War is, in this view, a costly process of information revelation. You learn the truth about the other side's capabilities by fighting them. The second failure is commitment problems. Suppose country A is growing rapidly and country B knows that in 10 years country A will be much more powerful and will be able to extract much better terms by force. Country A and country B might reach an agreement today, but country B cannot credibly commit to honouring that agreement 10 years from now, when A is stronger. Country A knows this, and country A might prefer to fight now, while its relative position is better, rather than accept an agreement that B will not honour when the balance of power shifts. The inability to make credible commitments about future behaviour can make war preferable to peace. The third failure is indivisibility. Some things cannot be split. Jerusalem, a disputed coastline, a leader's prestige. When the thing being bargained over cannot be divided, it cannot be shared, and the negotiated settlement may be infeasible. Fearon's framework has been enormously influential in international relations theory and policy. It suggests that reducing the risk of war requires making information more symmetric, reducing private information incentives, creating credible commitment mechanisms, treaties, international institutions, and monitoring regimes, and finding ways to make divisible what otherwise seems indivisible. We have already discussed mutually assured destruction, but the logic of nuclear deterrence has subtler game-theoretic dimensions that are worth exploring further. The central paradox of nuclear weapons is that their usefulness depends entirely on their never being used. A nuclear weapon that the enemy believes you will never actually fire is not a deterrent. A nuclear weapon that the enemy believes you might fire is the most powerful deterrent in human history. But making the enemy believe you will fire requires being willing to actually fire, which is the most destructive act imaginable. This is the paradox of credibility, and it has led to decades of strategic thinking about commitment, reputation, and the manipulation of beliefs. Thomas Schelling's concept of resolve is crucial here. In a crisis, what matters is not just your capabilities, but your opponent's belief about your willingness to use them. A less powerful country with a reputation for resolve, for following through on threats, may be a more effective deterrent than a more powerful country with a reputation for backing down. This is why small escalatory actions can serve a signaling function. They demonstrate resolve and update the opponent's beliefs about your willingness to escalate further. But signaling resolve is itself a game. If escalation always signals resolve and always leads the opponent to back down, then escalation becomes costless, and every country escalates. But then escalation no longer signals resolve. The equilibrium is not stable. The equilibrium requires that escalation be genuinely risky, that there is some probability it leads to further escalation rather than capitulation. And that genuine risk is what makes the deterrent credible. This is the dangerous game at the heart of nuclear diplomacy. And understanding its logic is not academic. It is a prerequisite for managing the most existential risks in human civilization. We have spent most of this documentary asking, given a game, what are the equilibria? What will rational players do? What outcomes will emerge? Mechanism design flips this question around. It asks, given the outcome I want to achieve, what game should I design so that rational players, pursuing their own self-interest, produce that outcome as an equilibrium? This is sometimes called the reverse game theory problem, and it is enormously powerful. Instead of analyzing existing strategic situations, you are engineering new ones. Instead of predicting what players will do, you are designing a system so that what players do produces what you want. The theory of optimal mechanism design asks, what is the best mechanism, the best set of rules for achieving a given goal, subject to the constraints that players are rational and have private information? Leonid Hurwicz, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2007 at the age of 90, was the founding father of mechanism design theory. He formalized the concept of an incentive-compatible mechanism, a set of rules under which truthful reporting of private information is a dominant strategy, or Nash equilibrium, for every participant. The revelation principle, one of the most fundamental results in mechanism design theory, states that for any mechanism that achieves some outcome in equilibrium, possibly involving complex strategic behavior, there exists a direct mechanism, one where players simply report their types honestly, that achieves the same outcome. This means you never lose generality by restricting attention to mechanisms where everyone tells the truth. The revelation principle enormously simplifies the search for optimal mechanisms. Roger Myerson applied mechanism design theory to auctions and proved a remarkable result. Under standard conditions, the auction format that maximizes the seller's expected revenue treats bidders asymmetrically based on their type distribution, sometimes even excluding some bidders from winning who have positive values for the object. The intuition is this: extracting more revenue from one bidder may require giving up some efficiency. If you know that bidder 1 is very likely to have a very high value, you can make the auction rules favor bidder 1 slightly, which allows you to extract more of their surplus without them defecting to not participating. But this might mean sometimes not selling to a second bidder whose value is actually higher, in cases where the type distributions make this the revenue-maximizing choice. Optimal mechanism design is thus not always efficient. The socially optimal allocation, the one that maximizes total surplus by putting the object in the hands of the person who values it most, can conflict with the individually optimal allocation from the seller's perspective. Revenue maximization and efficiency maximization are different goals and generally require different mechanisms. This trade-off between revenue and efficiency is not just an abstract theoretical concern. It arises in every auction design problem, in every regulatory tariff-setting process, in every procurement contract, in every tax policy decision. Understanding the trade-off and choosing the mechanism that strikes the right balance for a given policy objective requires exactly the kind of mechanism design analysis that game theorists have been developing since the 1970s. One of the most important and pervasive mechanism design problems is the principal-agent problem. A principal hires an agent to carry out a task. The principal cares about the outcome of the task, but can only imperfectly observe the agent's effort. The agent cares about the outcome, but also cares about the effort it requires, which is costly. If the principal cannot observe effort, the agent has an incentive to shirk, to exert less effort than the principal would want, pocketing the savings in effort cost. This is called moral hazard. It is the same information asymmetry problem, but applied to actions rather than types. The solution is contract design. The principal designs a compensation contract that gives the agent sufficiently high-powered incentives to exert effort by making the agent's compensation depend on observable outcomes that are correlated with effort. Performance pay, stock options for executives, profit sharing. These are all mechanisms designed to solve the principal-agent problem by aligning the agent's incentives with the principal's goals. But there is a fundamental trade-off. High-powered incentive contracts impose risk on the agent. If outcomes are noisy, reflecting not just the agent's effort, but also random factors outside the agent's control, then tying compensation tightly to outcomes means the agent bears a lot of risk. And risk-averse agents require a risk premium to bear that risk, making high-powered contracts expensive for the principal. The optimal contract balances incentive provision and risk sharing. The optimal power of incentives decreases with the noisiness of the outcome signal, the agent's degree of risk aversion, and the sensitivity of the outcome to the agent's effort. This is a precisely characterized result in contract theory, derived directly from mechanism design principles. This theory applies to employment contracts, executive compensation, insurance, agricultural sharecropping, franchising, regulation of utilities, and countless other situations where a principal tries to induce an agent to act in the principal's interest, despite unobservable effort and information asymmetry. As the digital economy has grown, markets and strategic interactions have moved online and become automated at scales unimaginable a generation ago. Online advertising auctions run billions of times every day, each one a game played in milliseconds between bidding algorithms. High-frequency trading creates a financial market that is itself a massive automated game played at microsecond timescales. Platform algorithms that recommend content or set prices are making strategic decisions that have been optimized by machine learning, but whose game-theoretic properties may be poorly understood. Algorithmic game theory, a field at the intersection of computer science, economics, and game theory, studies the computational aspects of strategic interaction. It asks, how do you compute equilibria? How expensive is it computationally to find them? What happens when computationally bounded agents play games, agents who cannot perform unlimited computation in the time available to make a decision? How do you design mechanisms that are not just game-theoretically optimal, but also computationally tractable, meaning they can be implemented efficiently by algorithms? The Price of Anarchy, introduced by Elias Koutsoupias and Christos Papadimitriou in 1999, is a concept that measures how much worse the Nash equilibrium outcome of a game is compared to the socially optimal outcome. It quantifies the social cost of selfish behavior. In traffic networks, for example, when each driver chooses the route that minimizes their own travel time, the result can be significantly worse than the socially optimal flow of traffic. The famous Brace paradox demonstrates that adding a new road to a network can actually increase travel times for everyone, because the individually rational response to the new road leads to a Nash equilibrium that is worse than the equilibrium without the road. The price of anarchy in traffic networks can be significant. In some networks, selfish routing increases total travel time by up to 50% over the social optimum. Understanding the price of anarchy in different types of networks and games helps engineers design systems that minimize the gap between selfish and optimal behavior, either by changing the game structure, taxing certain behaviors, or providing information that nudges players toward better equilibria. The application of game theory to evolutionary biology, which we discussed earlier, has continued to grow and deepen. Evolutionary game dynamics study not just which strategies are evolutionarily stable, but how populations evolve over time from any starting condition toward stable equilibria. The replicator dynamic is the most studied evolutionary dynamic. It describes how the frequency of different strategies in a population changes over time based on how the fitness or payoff of each strategy compares to the population average. Strategies that do better than average grow in frequency. Strategies that do worse than average shrink. The replicator dynamic is a differential equation system that describes continuous evolution. A key result is that the stable fixed points of the replicator dynamic are a subset of the Nash equilibria of the underlying game. Evolution converges to Nash equilibria. But not all Nash equilibria are stable fixed points of the replicator dynamic. Some are unstable and will be abandoned by evolution from any small perturbation. The stability conditions for evolutionary dynamics provide an additional refinement criterion beyond the Nash equilibrium concept. Cultural evolution applies similar ideas to the evolution of beliefs, norms, and behaviors in human populations. Ideas spread through populations by processes of social learning, imitation and selection, analogous in some ways to biological evolution, but operating at much faster timescales and with important differences including directed learning and large-scale information transmission. Cultural evolutionary game theory studies how norms of cooperation, punishment, fairness, and other social behaviors emerge, stabilize, and change through cultural evolutionary processes. Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson, along with their collaborators, have developed influential models of cultural group selection in which human societies compete, and societies with more cooperative norms outperform and eventually spread at the expense of societies with less cooperative norms. This mechanism may explain the extraordinary scale of human cooperation, which involves cooperation among millions of strangers who will never interact again, a scale of cooperation with no analogue in any other biological species. At the most exotic frontier of game theory, researchers have been exploring what happens when strategic interaction is governed not by classical probability, but by quantum mechanics. Quantum game theory, first systematically explored by Isert, Wilkins and Leuenstein in a 1999 paper, considers games where players can use quantum strategies, meaning strategies involving quantum superposition and entanglement, rather than classical mixed strategies. The results are striking. In the quantum version of the prisoner's dilemma, if both players use quantum strategies, the prisoner's dilemma can be resolved. There exist quantum strategies that lead to the cooperative outcome as an equilibrium, something impossible in the classical version of the game. The dilemma dissolves. This is because quantum entanglement, the correlation between quantum particles that Einstein called spooky action at a distance, can create a kind of mutual dependence between players' strategies that is impossible in classical games. A quantum player strategy is not just a probability distribution over actions, but a quantum state in a Hilbert space, and the correlations between entangled strategies can support cooperative equilibria that do not exist in classical game theory. It is not entirely clear yet what the practical implications of quantum game theory are for real strategic situations. Human beings do not currently make quantum entangled decisions, but as quantum computing becomes a reality, quantum game theory may become relevant for understanding strategic interactions between quantum computers, and perhaps for understanding phenomena in quantum systems where a game theoretic lens might be illuminating. We have travelled a long way, from von Neumann's minimax theorem to Nash's equilibrium, from the prisoner's dilemma to the Folk theorem, from the hawk-dove game to kin selection and reciprocal altruism, from nuclear deterrence to kidney exchange, from auctions to mechanism design, from behavioral economics to quantum games. And throughout this journey, we have seen both the extraordinary power and the profound limitations of game theory. The power. Game theory gives us a precise mathematical language for describing strategic interaction. It generates testable predictions about how rational agents will behave. It has been applied successfully to explain phenomena in economics, political science, biology, computer science, and psychology. It has been used to design real institutions, from auction formats to matching markets to kidney exchange programs that save billions of dollars and thousands of lives. The limitations. Real people are not always rational in the game theoretic sense. They care about fairness, not just self-interest. They have biases, heuristics, and emotions that systematically distort their decision-making. They play games in complex social contexts, embedded in networks of relationships, norms, and institutions that simple game models do not capture. And even among perfectly rational players, the problem of equilibrium selection, of knowing which of the many possible equilibria will actually be played, remains partly unsolved after 7 decades of research. But perhaps the deepest and most important lesson of game theory is not a technical one. It is a conceptual one. The lesson is this: the outcomes of strategic interaction are not simply the sum of individual choices. They are the emergent consequence of an entire system of interconnected decisions, each conditioned on all the others. You cannot understand what happens in a strategic interaction by looking at any one player in isolation. You must look at the whole system. You must think about incentives, information, beliefs, and the mutual conditioning of choices across all players simultaneously. This is a profoundly different way of thinking about human behavior, social organization, and institutional design than the one that dominated before game theory existed. It is a more accurate way, and learning to think this way changes how you see almost everything. Look around you. Every institution you interact with is a game. The labor market is a matching game. The financial market is an auction. The political system is a multiplayer bargaining game with changing coalitions. Every organization you belong to, every company you work for, every community you're a member of, operates through a web of strategic interactions among individuals with different interests and information. The way these institutions are designed, the rules that govern strategic interaction within them, determines what equilibria emerge. Bad institutional design produces bad equilibria. Corruption, inefficiency, conflict, tragedy of the commons. Good institutional design produces good equilibria. Cooperation, efficiency, innovation, shared prosperity. Game theory is the science of designing good games, of building institutions whose rules channel self-interest toward collectively desirable outcomes, of figuring out what it means for a system of strategic interaction to be well designed, and how to get from where we are to where we want to be. This is not just an academic exercise. It is one of the most important practical problems facing human civilization. How do you build international institutions capable of solving global problems, from climate change to pandemic preparedness to the governance of artificial intelligence, when there is no global government and countries are rational actors pursuing their own interests? How do you design economic systems that harness competition and self-interest without collapsing into inequality, environmental destruction, and financial instability? How do you build communities and social norms that sustain cooperation and fairness at scale? These are all, at their core, game design problems. And game theory, with all its limitations and open questions, is the best intellectual toolkit we have for thinking about them rigorously. Here is something that should stop you. By the predictions of standard game theory, applied to the one-shot games that most human interactions in large modern societies resemble, human beings should be far more selfish and far less cooperative than they actually are. We give to strangers. We follow rules when no one is watching. We help people we will never meet again. We donate to distant causes. We punish unfairness at personal cost. We honor commitments even when breaking them would be profitable. Why? The game-theoretic answer involves the mechanisms we discussed: kin selection, reciprocal altruism, reputation, cultural norms, altruistic punishment. These mechanisms, operating over long stretches of evolutionary and cultural history, have produced a human psychology that is not the hyper-selfish Homo economicus of naive economic theory, but something much richer and much stranger. We are, as the anthropologist Robert Boyd and his colleagues argue, the products of cultural group selection. A species whose social behavior has been shaped not just by individual-level selection, but by the competition between societies with different cultural norms. We have evolved, culturally and perhaps biologically, to be capable of large-scale cooperation among strangers, to internalize social norms, to feel shame and guilt when we violate them, to feel moral outrage when others violate them, and to punish violators even at personal cost. These psychological mechanisms are not perfectly rational in the game-theoretic sense. They are approximations, heuristics that work well enough in the environments our ancestors evolved in, and that have been carried forward into a world that is very different from the ancestral environment. Sometimes they lead us astray. The same in-group solidarity that enables cooperation within groups can produce hostility toward out-groups. The same punishment instincts that enforce cooperation can be triggered by perceived norm violations in contexts where they are costly and counterproductive. But they also enable something extraordinary. They enable a species of primate with no greater individual intelligence than its closest relatives to build cities, science, art, medicine, and global civilization. The social game we play, with all its strategic complexity and its departures from narrow rationality, is what makes us human. John Nash died in 2015. His equilibrium concept is now 75 years old. Von Neumann's minimax theorem is over 100 years old. And yet game theory is arguably more active, more relevant, and more important today than at any previous point in its history. The questions that remain open are some of the deepest in social science. We still do not have a fully satisfactory theory of equilibrium selection, a principled way of predicting which of multiple equilibria will be played in a given context. We still do not have a fully integrated theory of rational and behavioral game theory, a unified framework that captures both the rigorous logic of the Nash equilibrium and the rich, systematic irrationalities documented by behavioral economists. We still do not fully understand how cooperation at the scale of modern human societies arose and is sustained, or how to design institutions that extend the reach of cooperation to global problems that no existing institution can solve. We still do not know how to analyze multi-agent AI systems with the same rigor that game theory brings to human strategic interaction, or how to ensure that these systems converge to equilibria that are desirable from a human perspective. We still do not have a complete mechanism design theory for dynamic environments, for situations where the game itself is changing over time as players learn, adapt, and strategically manipulate the environment. These are the frontiers, and they are not just intellectual puzzles. They are the problems on whose solution the quality of human civilization in the 21st century may significantly depend. The game is not over. It never is. In today's documentary, we discussed game theory. We started with a man in Princeton who noticed that economics had no language for strategic interdependence. We watched a young genius invent the concept of Nash equilibrium before descending into decades of mental illness and emerging miraculously to receive the Nobel Prize at the age of 66. We saw how the same mathematical framework that explains why poker players bluff also explains why nuclear superpowers maintained an uneasy peace for 40 years. We learned that the logic of natural selection produces evolutionarily stable strategies that look like Nash equilibria, and that cooperation among selfish organisms can emerge from the simple mathematics of repeated interaction. We saw how mechanism design, the engineering of strategic situations, has been used to save thousands of lives through kidney exchange programs and to raise billions of dollars through auction design. We watched behavioral economics reveal the systematic ways in which real human beings depart from game theoretic rationality, and saw how those departures can themselves be harnessed to improve social outcomes. And we saw throughout a single unifying thread. Strategy is unavoidable. Wherever there are multiple agents with interests that interact, wherever one person's choices affect the outcomes available to others, game theory is the language of what is happening. It is not a specialized technical toolkit for economists or biologists. It is a fundamental framework for understanding social reality. When you negotiate a salary, you are playing a bargaining game. When you decide whether to vote, you are participating in a public goods game. When you choose a career, you are making a strategic bet in a competitive labor market. When you decide whether to follow a social norm, you are playing a coordination and cooperation game with everyone around you. When your immune system attacks a pathogen, the pathogen is evolving defenses in an evolutionary arms race that is, at the population level, a game. When you make a promise, you're engaging in a commitment device designed to change the strategic situation for both you and the person you promised. Everything is a game, not in the trivial sense that everything is fun, in the profound sense that every outcome is the joint product of multiple interacting choices, each conditioned on all the others, and understanding that structure is the beginning of understanding almost everything about how the world works. John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern saw this in 1944. John Nash formalized it in 1950. And the 75 years since have seen an explosion of insight, application and discovery that none of them could have anticipated. We are still learning the rules of the game we have always been playing. And that, perhaps, is the most important insight of all.